On August 3rd, 1890, when the noon shade in Coldwater measured 106 degrees against the post outside Elias Rook's store, the spring that had founded the settlement made no sound at all. For 14 years, that water had run from limestone with a steady throat-like murmur, enough to sustain 327 souls, horse lines, cook fires, and a freight stop built on confidence more than caution. That day, men crouched at the stone lip and heard only flies. Women stood with pails in 2-hour lines that no longer moved, and dust rose from the wagon ruts in pale sheets that looked almost white under the sun. By evening, cattle nosed dry troughs and stamped without purpose, and every household in Coldwater understood the same hard arithmetic. One spring road, one freight road, and no reserve were not a plan but a wager. 2 years earlier, on July 11th, 1888, a mule wagon had rolled into that same town under calmer skies, and the woman walking beside it had not come to gamble. Brett Graham was 31 years old, broad-shouldered from field labor, heavy-wristed from ironwork, and deliberate in every movement, not because she was slow, but because she had learned what haste cost when water failed. She purchased 20 acres of fractured basalt on the North Ridge for $7 an acre. Cash counted on Rook's counter in front of 3 witnesses, because nobody in Coldwater believed rock that could not be plowed had any value beyond quarry stone. The tract had no timber worth milling, no meadow grass worth cutting, and no visible seep. It had slope, fracture lines, and elevation. Those were the qualities she wanted. Brett had come west with a smaller family and reached Coldwater alone. Near Fort Laramie 5 summers earlier, she and her husband Owen had trusted a hand-dug well through a dry spell that lengthened past all memory. They had hauled from it until the draw bucket came up cloudy, then thin, then almost empty. Owen worsened first under dehydration fever and died before dawn, on the 4th day after the well turned foul. Their infant daughter Ruth followed him 6 days later, in the hour before sunrise, wrapped in a flour sack made soft by wear. Brett buried both beside the cracked pump housing she had insisted would hold. The failure did not make her mystical or wild-eyed. It made her exact. She spent the years after that burial following survey crews, irrigation crews, and stonemasons when she could earn a day's wage and watch their methods. And she kept a ledger not of money alone, but of mistakes, gradients, seep rates, and weather turns. Coldwater met that discipline with easy contempt. Elias Rook, merchant and council head, wore broadcloth coats even in heat, and kept his beard clipped close, a man whose prosperity rested on full shelves and predictable dependence. He had built his authority by extending credit in spring and collecting in fall, by speaking first at church steps, by deciding which haulers got priority when freight wagons came late. He asked Brett at purchase what she planned to raise on basalt. She answered, storage. He laughed in a way meant for an audience and said she would raise a cemetery for rain. Within a week, he had coined the name that followed her through market days and Sunday gatherings alike: Graham's Gutter Grave. Men repeated it while weighing flour. Women repeated it while buying lamp oil. Children heard it and tested the shape of it without understanding. Friend, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Whether you are in high country, dry plains, or a town that trusts one water source too much, these frontier lessons still matter. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Brett answered none of them in public. At dawn, she rode her bay mare, Juniper, to the ridge and began marking rock with charcoal lines, each line tied to fall and angle rather than appearance. Her only spoken reply came one morning when 2 teamsters repeated Rook's nickname close enough to be heard, and she laid a hand along Juniper's neck and said, "Let them talk. Stone keeps what pride cannot." Then she returned to work. She bought a star drill, a 12-pound sledge, a mason's plumb bob, and 200 feet of linen line from a passing tool wagon for $18.40. From Rook, she bought only what no one else sold: lamp wicks, blasting powder, and lime. Each item paid in coin because he refused her credit before she ever requested it. She set her first test cuts at 3 inches deep and 5 inches wide, narrow enough to force flow, broad enough to clear grit with a brush. She ran a bucket test from each cut after every strike sequence, timing descent with a pocket watch she had carried since Laramie. Where water pooled, she recut. Where the rock flaked, she shifted. By the second week of August 1888, the ridge above her tract held a visible geometry that looked to outsiders like scars, and to Brett like a map. Finger channels stepping downslope toward 2 future cistern mouths, staked in white ash. She sank those cisterns by hand and hired 2 Paiute stoneworkers from a rail camp for 6 days at $2 each per day, plus meals, to shape the interior walls true. Each chamber measured 14 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 9 feet deep, oriented north-facing to reduce heat load in late afternoon. She lined the walls with lime plaster, mixed 3-to-1 with washed sand, laid in 4 coats over roughened stone, and cured under damp canvas. She built settling pockets above each inlet, 1 foot lower than the channel floor, so first flush silt would drop before reaching storage. She set removable cedar lids with iron strap hinges, then stitched canvas skirts beneath them to keep dust from blowing into the seam. None of it was elegant. All of it was repeatable. The town called it obsession because that word was easier than measurement. Rook stood at his storefront rail in September and told a cluster of ranch hands that Graham would die guarding an empty hole, and they laughed in the practiced rhythm of men aligning themselves with power. Yet her ledger advanced. 42 pounds of powder consumed, 116 drill points sharpened, 71 yards of primary cut completed before first frost, $9 paid for charcoal and washed river sand hauled from 12 miles east. She spent where structure mattered and saved where labor could substitute for purchase, braiding filter sacks from old flour cloth, shaping overflow lips from salvage plank, using a simple water level of clear hose and marked stakes to verify pitch at 1/4 inch drop per 8 feet. On clear evenings, she stood above the channels with juniper ground tied below and watched how shadow pooled in the cuts, because shadow meant cooler stone and slower evaporation. In town, they called her work a grave. On the ridge, she built a reservoir system 1 strike at a time, against mockery, against memory, and against the dry arithmetic that had already taken a husband and a child once before. By late October 1888, the basalt ridge carried the sound of iron from first light until dusk, and the channels that townsfolk called scars had extended another 90 yards along the contour line above Brett Graham's lower cistern. She worked in sequences that looked severe but were carefully ordered: drill holes at 12-inch intervals, powder charges measured in folded paper twists, tamping clay packed with a hardwood rod, then controlled strikes that widened the groove without shattering the lip that would guide future flow. When she exhausted daylight, she moved under lantern, not to cut but to inspect, trailing her fingers along each runnel to feel burrs and loose grit, because in summer even a thumb-width obstruction could divert gallons into waste over the course of an hour. Juniper stood ground-tied beside the tool crate, ears flicking at each dull report. The mayor had learned the pattern before the town had. The first week of November brought 2 weak storms that laid less than half an inch of precipitation on Coldwater, and Brett treated them as full rehearsals. She opened inlet gates at both settling pockets, timed arrival at each basin with her watch, and marked the water rise against cedar rods notched in 1/4-inch increments. The upper catchment carried too much suspended silt from fresh cuts, so she added a second drop pocket and lined it with removable slate trays she could lift and clean. The lower catchment moved clear but too fast through the filter sacks. So she rebuilt the throat with a stone choke no wider than 6 inches and a layered column of charcoal, coarse sand, then fine sand in canvas sleeves. The revision cost $3.70 in extra cloth, lime, and wagon freight from Eagle Pass. It gained her cleaner storage. She entered both facts in the ledger with equal weight. Rook saw only cost and deviation. He denied her access to shared hauling days when teamsters pooled draft power for heavy stone, saying before 6 witnesses that cooperative labor belonged to productive acreage, not to vanity works carved by grief. At the church gate on a Sunday in December, he tapped his cane against her boot and told 2 ranch wives, loudly enough for the benches to hear, that Graham's gutter grave had become Coldwater's finest monument to stubbornness. One of those women, Miriam Bell, glanced at Brett and then away. The glance remained with her for many months. Brett did not answer Rook. She paid a Shoshone hauler $1.25 a load to bring cedar planks independently, and she cut and set her own stone caps across exposed runs to reduce noon evaporation by shade alone. By the turn of the year, January 1889, Coldwater counted 332 souls, 6 births and 1 burial added since harvest, and every household still believed the spring would recover with ordinary thaw. Brett believed in measurements instead. She had begun to keep a second table in her ledger, separate from expenses, recording dawn flow at the public spring whenever she came into town for supplies, dip depth at lip, seconds to fill a standard pail, visible turbidity, odor, and temperature by touch. The values drifted downward by increments too small for conversation and too steady for dismissal. She copied those numbers once each week onto a broad sheet and pinned it above her bench. The trend line did not bend. On the 17th of June, 1889, under a noon reading of 101 degrees and a sky without cloud break, the spring's yield dropped below 3 barrels for the day, and the queue at the stone trough stretched past the blacksmith shed. Rook announced at his store rail that private cask water would be sold at 30 cents per bucket until normal flow returned, and he called the rate temporary as though the word itself carried relief. At dusk, the town council met with freight agent Wallace Keene and approved funds for a deeper communal well, projected at $1,900, including casing, labor, and wagoned machinery. A traveling driller named Horace Venn promised water at 60 feet in the basin east of the church. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had left before consequences in other towns. Brett attended that meeting at the back wall and asked for one item in the record. That fractured shale in the East Basin bled fast in heat and rarely held through August unless sealed against lateral loss. She cited 2 failed shafts near Laramie and 1 near Medicine Bow, with depths and dates. Venn laughed, then invited any present soul to inspect his steel and judge whose knowledge counted. Rook moved to close discussion, the motion carried by raised hands. Work began 3 days later with hired labor at $2 per day and mule teams billed separately. At 42 feet, the first shaft collapsed after sidewall shear, burying tools and 3 days of effort. No one died in that collapse, but one laborer left with a broken wrist and did not return. The second shaft reached 58 feet and brought up bitter alkali that curled the tongue and sickened 2 calves by morning. Friend, if you are enjoying this story, hit that hype button now. It is free. It takes a second, and it helps this channel reach more folks who value hard-earned frontier lessons. Now, back to the story. After the second drilling failure, Brett changed the scale of her own work without ceremony. By early August 1889, she had stretched the catchment plan beyond her original tract line and negotiated written easements with 3 neighboring widows for runoff rights in exchange for guaranteed shares during shortage, 1 barrel every 2 days to each household, while storage held above half. She paid filing fees at the county desk and marked boundaries in stone, not paint, because paint disappeared in one season. Her primary channels became a network, 620 yards of finger cuts, each 3 inches deep and 5 inches wide, pitched by plumb bob and water level toward 2 plastered cisterns and 1 auxiliary vault she carved to 7 feet depth as a contingency basin. She added overflow trenches feeding kitchen plots for beans and squash, and she set low stone weirs every 20 feet on steeper runs to slow erosive surge. The account book for that expansion closed at $214 even by March 1890. Powder, iron, lime, cedar lids, strap hinges, charcoal, wagoned sand, canvas, and replacement drill steel. Rook refused to carry the charges, so she paid cash to traveling vendors and one Mormon tinsmith who accepted cured hides for part of his fee. The refusal isolated her more sharply than mockery had. Men who once traded day labor turned their eyes to the street center when she passed. 2 families withdrew invitations for shared harvest suppers. Children repeated the nickname at a distance and then fell silent when she turned. The social machinery of the town had chosen its axis, and for a season it was not mercy. February passed with thin snow and a wind that scoured drifts off ridge crests before they could soak. In the first week of March 1890, Brett began marking field signs alongside the flow table. Geese crossed north 2 weeks early in long, ragged lines that did not settle in the marsh east of town. Cottonwood buds opened and then browned at the edge under sudden heat. Ant colonies raised mounds unusually high against the south walls, a pattern she had seen before late dry spells when ground moisture retreated quickly. At the spring, the strongest thread no longer held through pre-dawn. By sunrise, the flow recovered slightly, then thinned again by noon. Those details were not folklore to her. They were indicators of storage decline in stone. Rook called those observations superstitions of a woman who listened to insects instead of men with businesses. He said it at the feed counter while setting prices for grain that had already climbed by 1/3 since winter, and those who depended on his ledger repeated him because credit bound opinion in cold water more tightly than evidence did. Yet some households had begun small imitations in secret. Short roof runnels cut from salvage boards, barrels shaded with scrap canvas, shallow settling buckets near porch steps. No one named Brett as source in public. The resemblance was visible anyway. On July 9, 1890, the mountains west of Coldwater released a compact storm cell that crossed the ridge in under 40 minutes and dropped 1.8 inches of rain by Brett's gauge. Town roofs shed the water in muddy sheets into wagon ruts and alleys, but her channels carried it in ordered streams to both cistern mouths, where first flush gates routed debris into settling pits and clean surge entered storage. By sunset, her primary chamber had risen by a measured 12,000 gallons, and the auxiliary basin had taken another 3,100. She posted the figures on a board at her gate with date, duration, and estimated losses. The numbers stood for 3 days before someone tore the board down at night. She wrote them again the next morning. Lena Ortiz came on the 4th day with 2 empty crocks and a folded note from her mother, Soledad, written in careful script that requested purchase if purchase were permitted. Lena was 12 years old, sun-dark, braid tied with blue thread, and formal in the manner of children asked to carry adult dignity. Brett read the note, set it in her pocket, rinsed both crocks with a dipper of filtered water, and filled them to the shoulder seam. She charged nothing. She told Lena to keep lids wrapped in damp cloth at noon and to store both vessels against the north wall where shade held longest. Lena listened without interruption and repeated each instruction back in order. The next morning she returned with 3 more containers and 2 boys from neighboring houses who carried poles for hauling. By the 3rd week of July, Brett had drafted ration tables on brown paper and nailed them under the awning of her tool shed. household allotments by head count, livestock priority by age and work need, boiling guidance for doubtful draws, cleaning intervals for filter columns, and penalties for tampering with line order. She organized watch rotations at dawn and dusk to prevent theft and panic, assigning posts by surname without preference, including her own name on the night shift roster every third evening. She established one standing reserve marked in red ink for widows, children, and travelers. When questioned by those who had once mocked her, she answered in terms of arithmetic and survival, not virtue. Coldwater had begun, quietly and against its own pride, to move toward her gate. The spring still produced a narrow run in those days, enough to sustain argument in men who feared the cost of admitting error. But the arguments weakened each noon as the trough level fell. The old nickname did not disappear. Its tone changed first. Then its meaning followed. The next dawn, when the line at her gate formed before the sun touched the ridge, 4 men arrived not with containers but with picks and a wagon tongue on their shoulders, asking where she wanted the next cut to run. Brett pointed them upslope, handed each a marked stake, and set Lena Ortiz to reading names as if she were calling attendance at a schoolroom, because labor had to be counted before water could be trusted. She had already learned that goodwill without structure failed by the 3rd day, while a clear roster survived fatigue and resentment both. By the end of July 1890, the work had ceased to be one woman's private preparation and become a distributed system across the north side of Coldwater, still anchored by Brett's original channels, but now widened by copied methods and corrected grades. She refused broad trenches that looked impressive and lost flow to heat. She insisted on narrow runnels and clean lips. Each household team began with 20 yards of pilot cut, measured at 3 inches depth and 5 inches width, then water tested with 2 buckets poured from the upper marker stone. If the flow reached the settling pocket in under 4 minutes, the grade held. If not, they recut. She made them test twice, then again after noon heat. She also expanded storage where the ridge allowed it, not by digging deep in crumbly soil, but by carving lateral vaults into shaded faces where basalt stayed cool after sunset. The 3rd vault, begun on July 24th, ran 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet deep, with a sloped floor toward a sump depression that could be cleaned with a flat scoop. Material costs were recorded on a board at her shed: 9 sacks of lime at $1.10 each, 40 feet of cedar plank at 14 cents per foot, 2 hinges forged by the blacksmith for $2 total, and a mule load of sand traded for 3 days of channel training. She accepted labor exchange in place of coin, but she did not accept vague promises. Every trade entered the ledger with date, amount, and witness. The technical refinements multiplied. She taught Soledad Ortiz and Miriam Bell to braid double-layer filter sleeves from flour cloth, with coarse charcoal wrapped inside and fine sand stitched into the outer sheath, so cleaning could be done in stages rather than by full replacement. She added first flush diverters on 3 roof-fed lines by fitting pivot boards at the inlet. The initial muddy surge dropped into waste pits. Then a pin could be pulled to direct clearer runoff into storage. She ordered all cedar lids to receive felt strips soaked in tallow along the seam, reducing dust infiltration and afternoon evaporation both. She showed boys who had once repeated her nickname how to hold a chisel at a low angle, so the channel wall would shear smooth instead of fracturing into cups that trapped sediment. None of the instructions were dramatic. All of them preserved gallons. 3 days passed with no cloud cover, and each day she advanced the same routine at first light. Inspect inlets, scrape grit, clear ant drift, test flow, update ration board, assign hauling pairs, and reweigh reserves against projected demand at 104 degrees. She marked households by need, not by favor. Elderly souls and nursing mothers received priority draw at dawn. Teamsters hauling communal barrels received second draw. Livestock allotments were cut by 1/4 except for draft teams on water duty. Arguments came daily. Arithmetic answered them. As the system grew more visible, the town's resistance changed shape. Open laughter at the ridge gave way to organized attempts to reclaim control, because the same men who had dismissed her methods could not tolerate a line that did not begin at Elias Rook's counter. He called a council session on July 28th in the church annex and proposed that all distributed water pass through the store yard for orderly accounting, with a handling fee of 5 cents per bucket to cover caskware and guard wages. Wallace Keene seconded him. 2 ranchers nodded before the proposal was even read in full. Brett attended, stood at the back wall, and waited until the clerk finished writing. Then she asked one question in a level voice: whether the handling fee applied equally to widows, travelers, and children drawing from the emergency reserve already posted. Rook answered that business did not bend for sentiment. She replied that survival did. She laid her ledger on the table and invited any council member to inspect quantities, sources, and disbursements line by line. No one touched it for a long moment. The proposal failed by 1 vote when Miriam Bell, who had been silent in earlier meetings, said she would not pay a fee for water carried by her own hands from channels her own sons had cut. That defeat did not soften the social edge. It sharpened it. Rook began telling customers that Brett intended to hold the town in debt through obligation rather than price, and he repeated that claim at the church gate and outside the smithy until it took root among souls who preferred suspicion to gratitude. 2 families withdrew their labor teams from her morning roster after being told they would lose winter credit if they remained visible in her line. A sack of clean charcoal disappeared from her shed one night and reappeared split and wet behind the livery fence, useless for filtration. She said nothing in public about the theft. She set Lena to drying what could be salvaged and sent Juniper with a pack frame to collect fresh burn from a cedar stand upridge. On July 30th, a group of young men carved the old nickname into a plank and nailed it crooked above her lower gate. Graham's gutter grave. Letters cut deep for distance viewing. They expected a quarrel. She removed the plank at dawn, planed the board smooth, and reused it as a measurement chart beside the 3rd vault. By noon, the same board held notch marks for gallon rise and sediment depth. Children waiting with crocks began reading the numbers aloud, first as game, then as habit. Language shifted under usage. So did allegiance. The merchant still commanded influence where hunger and credit met, and he used both. He denied grain sales to 2 households that had joined Brett's hauling teams, stating stock limits while sacks remained visible on the rear shelf. He warned Wallace Keene that any freight laborer drawing from ridge reserves would be dropped from preferred accounts in autumn. Yet his own store yard grew quieter each evening, because cask water at 30 cents per bucket had already strained most households, and because even those who disliked Brett's authority could not argue with clear water when their own wells smelled of metal by noon. The strain inside cold water became not a contest between confidence and fear, but a non-trivial trade-off between pride and survival, and pride was expensive in heat. Brett maintained one rule through it all. No soul turned away at the gate if storage remained above emergency line. She did not ask who had mocked her. She asked household count, container volume, and whether anyone was ill. She kept the roster moving. She kept the filters clean. She kept speaking in measurements when others spoke in injury. By the 1st day of August, warning signs accumulated faster than conversation could absorb them. Dawn wind came from the south 3 mornings in succession, hot and dry before sunrise, carrying dust that usually rose only after noon. Night temperatures failed to drop below 82 degrees, and stone that should have shed heat by midnight remained warm to the palm. The spring basin showed a pale mineral ring 6 inches above current trickle, a hard outline of what had recently been normal flow. Frogs that had called from the marsh east of town fell silent. Cattle nosed trough edges and pulled back as if the smell itself offended them. Brett read these indicators as a system, not as isolated curiosities. She added a hazard column to the ration board and lowered standard household draw by 1 quart per head per day, while increasing the reserve protected for fever care and cooling cloths. She ordered all lids checked at midday and weighted with stone to block gust intrusion. She sent teams to shade exposed barrels with canvas and brush mats. She instructed that wash water be captured in separate tubs for dust control and latrine trenching, not discarded in alley mud. At the lower channels, she placed flat stones every 10 feet as visual flow gauges, so reductions could be seen at a glance by any worker, regardless of literacy. That evening, she rode Juniper to the public spring and took timed fills with Lena beside her, counting aloud so the girl could verify each number before entry. A pail that had filled in 58 seconds during July now took 140. The second trial slowed further. At pre-dawn, checked the next morning, the trickle thinned to a thread that broke twice while they watched. She scraped the limestone lip with a knife point and found powder-dry deposits where moisture should have clung. She recorded the time, 4:17 ante-meridium. She carried the figures directly to council at sunup. Rook was present, coat buttoned despite the heat, jaw set in the habit of command. She presented her sheet, stated the measured decline, and recommended immediate emergency protocol for all 327 souls, ration by registry, suspension of ornamental and stockyard use, mandatory boil for any well draw, and labor assignment to expand catchment before the next mountain storm. Rook answered that panic would do more harm than shortage and proposed waiting 3 days for expected freight casks from Cheyenne. Wallace Keene added that axle trouble had delayed wagons before and would clear. 2 others agreed. The motion to delay carried. Brett did not argue a second time. She returned to the ridge and ordered her own line tightened by noon schedule, then sent Lena with written notices to households already participating in the channel cruise. Bring containers at dawn. Bring tools at dusk. And assume no outside relief until barrels were visible in town. She assigned Miriam Bell to oversight at the lower gate and Soledad Ortiz to filter inspection at the upper vault. She moved 1/4 of remaining lime and all spare canvas into covered storage against sabotage and weather both. She filled Juniper's trough herself and stood beside the mare until the last drop was gone, then inverted the bucket so no one would mistake emptiness for neglect. Across town, men still said freight would arrive. They said the spring had dipped before. They said heat always broke by Sunday. But on the morning of August 2nd, when Brett and Lena reached the limestone lip before sunrise, the basin held only a dark sheen on stone and a single intermittent drip from a seam no wider than a nail. They listened for the old throat-like murmur that had named the settlement. There was none. Brett closed her watch, handed Lena the ledger, and told her to ring the school bell 3 times for emergency draw. The bell carried over cold water in 3 iron strokes that did not sound like worship or school, but like a tool striking a buried pipe. Doors opened before the final note had faded. Men came running with half-buttoned shirts, women with aprons still wet at the hem, boys dragging barrels that had held flour the week before. Brett stood at the lower gate with Lena Ortiz and Miriam Bell, ledger open on a crate, and turned panic into procedure with an authority that had been earned in stone long before anyone asked for it. Each household gave name, head count, and vessel measure. Each household received marked allotment. Those who argued waited. Those who lied were corrected by neighbors who had no patience left for theater. By noon on August 2nd, 1890, The shade post outside Rook's store read 104 degrees, and the heat pressed downward with a weight that seemed to come from iron, not sun. The communal well east of the church produced only a cloudy drawer that smelled of alkali and left a white crust on bucket rims by afternoon. A test bucket left in the smithy cooled to neither comfort nor safety by nightfall. Brett sent Soledad Ortiz to post boiling instructions at the church gate and the freight office, and sent 2 young teamsters to check every copied channel for blockages before dusk. The town's recent confidence in freight relief still held among the proud, but it held by will alone. At 3:30, a rider came from the Cheyenne Road, with 1 horse lathered to foam and 1 canteen empty. He reported a wagon train stalled 30 miles east near Dry Elk Crossing, 2 axles split on rutted stone, 1 wheel hub burned through after a downhill brake drag, and no spare iron within reach before at least 4 days. Wallace Keene took the report in the freight yard and swore he would send a recovery team at first light. Rook heard the same report, looked once at his barrel stacks, and changed his store placard before supper from 30 cents per bucket to $1 cash, no credit. He called it scarcity pricing for order. By evening, the line at his counter had shortened not because need had eased, but because coin had run out. The weather did not break. It hardened. On August 3rd, the noon reading reached 106 again, and the spring at the limestone lip gave no sound at all, only a dark stain that dried to powder while souls watched. Night brought no relief. The temperature at midnight remained 87, and blankets were abandoned on porches where sleep did not come anyway. Horses stood with lowered heads and flared nostrils, refusing warm trough water unless driven. Kitchen gardens failed in visible stages. Cucumber leaves first, then bean runners, then squash vines collapsing into brittle cords by the fence line. The wind rose from the south before sunrise and carried dust, fine as flour, into every seam not tarred or weighted. Brett's ridge system endured because it had been built for this exact arithmetic. The lids held. The first flush gates worked. The stone caps cut evaporation enough to matter. Yet endurance was not abundance, and she treated every gallon as if it already belonged to tomorrow. She shortened household draw by another quart per head on August 4th and posted the reduction in large figures, where even distant eyes could read it. She reassigned night guards to protect the upper vault after 2 attempted siphon thefts left scrape marks on the cedar seam. She set a boiling station beside the lower gate using 3 iron kettles loaned by families that had once refused her supper invitations. No speech accompanied the change. The work itself served as instruction. Rook's authority thinned as fast as his stock. The polished jars on his front shelf emptied first, then the nail bins, then the flour sacks set aside for favored accounts. By the 5th dry day, his cask room smelled sour. 2 barrels had spoiled from heat after poor sealing, and 1 had been cut with ditch water by a clerk who thought volume could replace quality. Rook tried to deny the adulteration until 3 buyers retched behind the hitch rail. That afternoon, he dismissed the clerk in public anger, but the performance convinced no one. The same men who had repeated his jokes at the church steps now crossed the street to stand in Brett's line because her water was clear, measured and clean. Near sundown that same day, 6-year-old Thomas Bell's fever turned hard and fast. With no clean cooling water left in his house between ration hours, cloth compresses warmed almost as soon as they touched his skin. He died before midnight with Miriam at his bedside, and word of it moved through town quieter than any bell. Friend, if Wild West retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. A couple dollars a month keeps stories like this coming and helps preserve this kind of frontier history. Now, back to the story. On August 5th, the first funeral of the crisis was prepared without bell or procession. Reverend Amos Pike, 62 years old, had kept visiting houses with scripture and a tin dipper during the heat, giving away portions from his own ration when he found homes where sickness had already narrowed voices to whispers. He collapsed on his church steps at dusk after returning from 3 such visits, still carrying an empty flask wrapped in wet cloth. He died before midnight with his hand resting on the rail he had varnished each spring since the church was raised. At dawn, Brett sent 2 barrels for washing and barrel use, entered both withdrawals in red, and stood back while the congregation lowered him into dry ground that had to be broken with picks before spades could bite. 2 days later, Wallace Keene rode east with 3 men and a light wagon to recover whatever freight could still be salvaged from Dry Elk Crossing. They found the stalled train, stripped 1 axle for parts, and loaded 6 casks that had sat in heat too long. Keene insisted on pushing through to Coldwater rather than camp until sunset. 10 miles west of the crossing, his lead horse stumbled in deep ruts and the wagon listed hard against a boulder, spilling 2 casks and throwing him to the ground. He rose once, waved the others forward, then collapsed beneath the wagon tongue with a broken collarbone, a split scalp, and heat sickness that left him half-conscious through the night. The men brought back 4 casks and Keene alive on August 8th, lashed to a plank with wet canvas over his chest, while Soledad and Lena worked to cool him at the gate. He survived, though his right arm hung in a sling for weeks, and the freight office ran on clerk signatures while his own line sat unfinished in the ledger. Clara Dunn died on the same day, and her death cut through Coldwater with a different sorrow because she had delivered half the town with steady hands and plain words. When the fever cases grew and washing water dwindled, she set out before sunrise with a handcart, 2 canteens, and a map to a rumored seep in a sandstone notch south of town that a trapper had mentioned in spring. She left a note at her table promising to return by dusk. She did not. A search party found her cart near a dry wash at first light the next morning, canteens empty, hat pinned under a stone against wind. They buried her beside Amos Pike before noon, with Soledad Ortiz reading a prayer, while Miriam Bell held the midwife's satchel against her chest, as if weight alone could keep memory from scattering. By the 9th day of sustained heat, Coldwater's social order had been reduced to essentials. Credit meant little. Titles meant less. Household survival now depended on distance to Brett's gate, willingness to haul under ration discipline, and ability to follow instructions without embellishment. She expanded line hours to begin 1 hour before sunrise and continue in 2 shifts separated by midday closure for filter cleaning. She posted Lena with a chalkboard to track each draw in public view so accusations of favoritism could not gather force. She required each container to be rinsed at the station before fill. She sent Juniper, now rib-shadowed but steady, in a 2-horse team hauling communal barrels to the far cabins, where elderly souls could not stand in line long enough to secure allocation. Still, desperation bred poor decisions. 2 ranch hands attempted night tapping of the upper channel with a shovel cut that diverted flow toward private troughs. The diversion failed after 12 yards when grade flattened, but it cost the morning line nearly 80 gallons in lost surge. Brett did not call for punishment beyond labor repayment. She ordered both men to spend 3 dawn shifts recutting the damaged lip under Lena's supervision, and when they had finished, she placed them on guard rotation with no public shaming. The system needed workers more than enemies. On August 11th, Elias Rook came to the ridge before sunrise and stood outside the marked line with his hat in both hands. His coat was unbuttoned, collar darkened with sweat, beard no longer trim but uneven from hurried knife work. Behind him stood 2 clerks carrying empty store casks that had once been stacked in his own yard as symbols of control. He waited until Lena called his name, then stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "I have 23 souls tied to my roof if one counts my household, staff and the 2 teamsters sleeping in my wagon shed. My barrels are spoiled or spent. My shelves are bare. I request ration issue under your posted rules." No one in line spoke. The silence held for several breaths, not hostile, not kind, only exhausted. Brett looked at him once, and then at the casks, then at Lena's board. She asked for vessel volume, household count, and whether there were fever cases under his roof. Rook answered each question without argument. She assigned his draw at standard rate, not reduced and not increased, and ordered one clerk to report at dusk for filter maintenance training. When he began to say more, she lifted a hand toward the line behind him. "Next name," she said. The line moved. Rook took his allocation and stepped aside for the Bell family, then for the Pikes, then for a pair of miners from the North Cut. By noon, his clerks were hauling under guard like every other team. By evening, he returned with a written list of his dependents and a request to join the Dawn labor roster in exchange for continued issue. Brett accepted the list, entered the names, and assigned him shovel duty at the new overflow trench, where the basalt fought every inch. He worked without comment until dark. Palms blistered through merchant skin. 3 days passed before the first cloud bank gathered over the western ridge, and in those 3 days the town did not recover, but it did not collapse. That distinction belonged to preparation, to procedure, and to a woman who had once been mocked for cutting channels in rock that no plow would ever touch. The cloud bank thickened through the afternoon, dark at the base and copper-edged where the sun struck it, and every soul on the ridge kept one eye on the sky while hands stayed on tools. Brett altered nothing in the line. She had seen too many storms split and die before reaching ground. She kept allotments tight, kept lids sealed, kept Lena at the board. Near sundown, the first drops fell, wide and hot, hissing on stone. Then the rain came hard enough to blur the far fence line. Brett shouted for gate crews to swing first flush diverters into waste pits, and the ridge answered in practice motion. Soledad pulled pins on the upper inlets. Miriam and 2 miners cleared drift from the lower throats with broom handles. Rook, coat stripped and sleeves rolled, stood knee-deep in runoff at the new overflow trench and lifted debris by hand where the grate had begun to choke. Within 20 minutes, the channels ran full. Narrow ribbons turned to bright moving bands under lantern light. The storm lasted 32 minutes by Brett's watch and dropped 1.3 inches at her gauge. It was not enough to end the crisis. It was enough to keep cold water alive. The upper vault rose by 3,900 gallons, the lower by 4,600, and the contingency basin gained 1,100 before spill lips engaged. Brett posted those figures at dawn on a board that no one tore down. By August 14th, she had shifted the system from emergency draw alone to emergency plus instruction. Each household receiving water now sent one worker for a morning lesson if they were physically able. Brett taught with the same measured severity she used for rationing. She showed how to lime wash cistern walls at 3 parts sand to 1 part lime, how to scrub charcoal sleeves without tearing seams, how to place settling pockets 1 foot below inlet grade so silt dropped where it could be lifted. She made them time flows, right numbers and repeat cuts until water obeyed slope rather than hope. The contrast with the failed communal well stood in plain sight. East of the church, $1,900 of borrowed confidence sat in a fenced pit of splintered shoring, bent casing, and alkali crust that no livestock would touch. On the ridge, $214 in tools and materials, multiplied by labor and discipline, carried the registered households still in town through the hottest fortnight in town memory. No speech was required to draw the comparison. Children could see it from the road. Rescue became routine, and routine became survival. Brett opened a shaded corner of her tool shed as a cooling room for fever cases at midday, with wet canvas hung across the doorway and drip pans beneath to reuse runoff for dust suppression. She assigned Clara Dunn's satchel to Soledad, who had apprenticed beside the midwife for 2 years, and she reserved 2 gallons each dawn for cloth cooling and wound cleaning before any household draw began. She converted one storage niche into grain porridge distribution for those too weak to cook, using sacks of beans and cornmeal traded in earlier seasons when coin had been thin but foresight had not. Juniper hauled until the mare's flanks showed hollow shadows. Then Brett rotated her to half-duty and paired her with a borrowed grulla gelding so no single animal carried the full burden. When arguments rose over livestock shares, Brett used one rule. Draft teams hauling communal water received maintenance ration. Breeding stock did not. Ranchers who had laughed at her desert farming accepted the terms because refusal meant no haul at all. The second storm arrived on August 19th, weaker but cold at its core, and for the first time in 16 days, the midnight temperature dropped below 70. The town exhaled without celebration. Fear had taught restraint. Brett kept emergency protocols in place through the end of the month, reducing only one restriction. She allowed each household one weekly washing draw for clothes and bedding to blunt disease spread. She posted the adjustment and signed it, then placed Lena's name beside hers as witness. When September opened with 2 steady rains and a light morning wind from the northwest, the immediate danger passed. No bell marked the moment. It showed itself in smaller signs. Children no longer sleeping in clothes near the line, kettles filled before dawn without pushing, men returning borrowed tools without being chased. The reckoning did not come as a tribunal. It came as footsteps at Brett's gate, one by one, often at awkward hours when pride could be carried privately. Miriam Bell came first, 3 days after the second September rain, carrying the plank that had once read, "Graham's Gutter Grave." She had sanded it clean and sealed it with linseed oil. She set it on the bench and spoke plainly, voice rough from sleepless weeks. I laughed when Elias said the name. I repeated it at my table where Thomas could hear me. Then my son died while your water kept other children cool through the night. I cannot call that ignorance. I call it shame. I'm asking no easy pardon. I'm asking what work belongs to me now. Brett answered after a long pause, hands still on a filter sleeve she had been mending. Thomas is not returned by speech, but work can keep another mother from standing where you stood. Bring 2 workers from your house for 10 mornings. Learn the grade lines. Then teach 2 more houses before winter. Miriam nodded once. She returned the next dawn with her brother and eldest daughter. Wallace Keene did not come to the gate. By then he had already been buried after the Dry Elk wreck, his salvage casks stacked as mute proof of what that last run had cost. A week after the burial, freight clerk Jonah Bristow came carrying Keene's dented survey chain and his own field notebook. He admitted he had argued for waiting on freight because freight was his trade and his pride. He admitted he had dismissed her numbers as fear. He offered to map every household roof pitch for runnel planning without fee, using Wallace's recovered chain and his own labor. Brett accepted and paired him with Lena, who checked his figures against actual flow after each rain and corrected him when he rounded estimates to comfort. Even the 2 ranch hands who had cut the channel at night came back after their penalty shifts ended, not to defend themselves but to ask for formal training. Brett set them to carving public reservoir lips where errors were visible to everyone. You broke trust with a shovel, she told them. You may rebuild it with one. Rook waited longest. Through mid-September, he worked every assigned dawn, paid for lime in cash without bargaining, and spoke little beyond tally numbers. The town watched him with a curiosity sharpened by memory. On September 22nd, after Sunday service, he stepped through the church gate and asked Brett, before those gathered, for leave to speak where all could hear. She gave a short nod. He faced the crowd first, not her. The broadcloth coat was gone, replaced by a work shirt bleached at the seams by sweat and soap. "I called this work a grave," he said, voice steady but thin. "I set it in my store, on these steps and in council. I use my ledger to starve cooperation and my price board to profit from fear. When the spring failed, I nearly made a grave of this town with those choices. Brett Graham kept my household alive under the same rules as every other. I was wrong in judgment and wrong in conduct. I say it here so no one can pretend I said less." No applause followed. The silence was heavy, then honest. Rook turned toward Brett at last. "I ask what restitution is possible, if any." Brett stepped forward one pace. Her answer carried to the back fence. "Your words did harm. So did mine when I spoke too late at times because I was tired of being mocked. But the dead cannot be argued back, and I will not trade in staged mercy. If you seek restitution, then join the same terms as every household. 2 workers for 10 mornings, a shared emergency cistern maintained year-round, and first claim in drought for widows, children, and travelers. No handling fee, no private line. If your store supplies hinges, lime, or canvas for that system at fair rate, record it in open ledger where all can read." Rook bowed his head once. "I accept." By the second week of October, the ridge rang again with iron, but now the sound came from many hands. Brett laid out a winter curriculum on brown paper. Channel maintenance after freeze-thaw, lid sealing before wind season, charcoal reburn technique, and emergency registry updates each quarter. She did not become soft. She became legible. Coldwater learned that generosity could be strict and still be generous. In November, the council voted to cap the failed communal well and set a marker stone beside it with costs carved plainly. $1,900 appropriated, no potable yield. Beneath that, at Brett's insistence, they added one line: "Numbers are not insult. Numbers are warning." The marker stood as public memory rather than punishment. Years moved. Some winters were kind, others mean. Freight resumed, then failed again in smaller episodes that no longer brought panic, because rooftops now fed carved runnels into communal reservoirs above town. By July 1900, Coldwater counted 401 souls. Every block kept a posted drought roster. Every spring inspection included children old enough to read a gauge stick. Lena Ortiz, grown and precise as her teacher, kept the master ledger in a cedar chest and trained new monitors each season. Roof maps begun from measurements Wallace Keene had logged before his fatal salvage run, then expanded and corrected by later crews, became standard attachments to property deeds. Miriam Bell supervised the widow's reserve until her hair silvered. Rook changed without becoming sentimental. He published prices on a public board each Monday, opened his account books to council review during dry months, and funded 2 public cistern lids each year from store profits. He never used the old nickname again. Few did. Brett remained on the basalt tract she had bought for $7 an acre when no one wanted stone. She expanded her original system in measured increments and refused every proposal to rename it after herself. "It is catchment," she said when pressed. "Name the practice, not the person." Yet language found its own path in Coldwater. Builders began saying a channel was cut Graham true when grade held from first pour. The largest basin still stands above the North Road, its lime-washed walls cool in summer shade. On the stone lip above the gauge marks, carved by many hands and recut when weather softened the edges, the inscription remains in daily use rather than ceremony. build for the year that does not forgive. The inscription remained in daily use rather than ceremony, and on the morning after the letters were recut, Brett stood beside the largest basin with a mallet in one hand and a ledger in the other, while 20 households gathered in a half-circle on the stone apron. She had called them by posted notice for a dry year drill, not because the sky was empty that week, but because memory weakened when barrels were full. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and even in that cool hour, the routines of August 1890 returned to every hand that had survived it. Lena Ortiz unlocked the cedar chest and laid out the teaching items in deliberate order on a wool blanket. The dented survey chain recovered from Wallace Keene's run to Dry Elk Crossing, his field notebook with roof pitches and corrected gradients, Clara Dunn's satchel now restocked and labeled for fever cloths, and the plan board that had once carried the words Graham's Gutter Grave and now carried gauge notches worn smooth by use. Brett placed each object where children could touch it after instruction, because she wanted tools to remain tools, not relics beyond reach. She began with allocations. Widows first, then families with infants, then labor teams, then stock draw by work class. She made every monitor call volumes aloud and write them twice, once on slate and once in ink, while Rook's 2 clerks checked arithmetic in open view. The exercise consumed 2 hours and ended with no shouting, no pushing, and no private line. When one young rancher asked whether the old emergency reserve still exempted travelers, Brett pointed to the red-marked column and said the rule had never changed. A town that survives by closing its gate forgets why it survives at all. At midday, she moved instruction under shade and taught the maintenance sequence that had kept water clear during the killing heat. Scrape inlet lips with blunt steel. Empty settling pockets before they crusted. Wash charcoal sleeves in separate tubs and reseal cedar seams with tallow felt before dust storms. Soledad Ortiz demonstrated cooling room setup with wet canvas and drip pans, then reassigned 3 girls to pack porridge tins exactly as Brett had done when fever had spread. The contrast stood plain in the ledger board hung behind them. On one side, $1,900 spent on the failed east well, no potable yield. On the other, $214 of original materials, then communal labor, yearly maintenance, and posted reserves that had carried 327 souls through 11 days above 104 degrees. By the 3rd week of October 1890, the council called an evening assembly at the church gate to formalize the water charter, and Brett attended only after Lena reminded her that rules written without witnesses were rules invited to be forgotten. Lanterns hung from hitch rails. The basin wine smelled of sage and lime dust. No one laughed as they had in 1888. Rook's public confession had already been delivered at this same gate on September 22nd and entered in the ledger. The night's work was to bind that admission to enforceable clauses. Rook spoke first, as council head, but not from the steps. He stood on the ground among the line markers, hat under his arm, and read the opening clauses in full voice. Emergency reserve percentages, public posting of draw totals, prohibition of scarcity surcharges, mandatory training days, and annual inspection dates tied to spring thaw and midsummer heat. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked toward Brett without flourish. "There is one matter not in the clauses," he said. "I named this system Graham's Gutter Grave. I used that name to turn caution into ridicule. I set bucket prices at $1 when fear was highest. I told men her figures were superstition. Those statements were false in fact and harmful in effect. Let the record hold the words exactly." He stepped back. Silence held, then shifted as others came forward one at a time, not compelled, not rehearsed. Jonah Bristow lifted Wallace Keene's notebook in both hands and confessed that he had torn down Brett's Rainfall board after the July storm in 1890 because he had feared the numbers would embarrass the freight office and weaken confidence in delayed wagons. He said he had told no one for 10 years. He had kept the ripped tacks in his desk as if a hidden object could postpone debt. He placed those tacks on the council table and asked that the act be entered in writing, not forgiven by omission. Eli and Martin Hale, the ranch hands who had once cut the channel at night, admitted they had also stolen the charcoal sack from Brett's shed and split it behind the livery fence when wet weather made it useless. They had done it out of anger at ration cuts to breeding stock, then watched children carry muddy water because filter media ran short. They offered 2 mule loads of cedar and 6 weeks of labor for the upper reservoir rebuild, and Brett told them labor owed should be directed to training crews from outlying cabins where maintenance still lagged. Miriam Bell stepped forward last among the early speakers, carrying Thomas Bell's tin cup, polished bright from years of handling. She did not ask for absolution. She asked for permanence. Write his name in the reserve registry, she said, not for mourning, for measurement. Let every child monitor know that 1 cup of clean water at dusk can be the distance between a fever breaking and a burial. The cleric wrote it. No one objected. When the admissions ended, the council waited for Brett's answer, and the wait itself showed how completely authority had moved from title to practice. She did not mount the church step. She remained beside the marker stone where costs were carved. You seek a single sentence that closes harm, she said. I do not possess one. Words injured this town. Heat injured it more. The dead remain dead, and I will not cheapen them by pretending otherwise. What I can offer is structure. Keep the ledgers open. Post every price. Train every household until knowledge is common property. If you call that forgiveness, that is your word, not mine. She turned toward the children holding slate boards. From this season forward, no child in Coldwater is too young to learn a gauge stick, a boiling line, and a lid seal. Pride is not a water plan. Procedure is. By first frost that year, the charter was in force. 3 key custodians held separate locks to the emergency cisterns. Soledad Ortiz, Miriam Bell, and Jonah Bristow, chosen precisely because their histories differed and each had publicly acknowledged error. The freight office report line from Cheyenne Road became a posted bulletin at the store porch every Monday. Delayed wagons were now met with ration adjustments the same day, not hopeful rumor. The old salvage casks from Wallace Keene's final run were broken into staves and reused as shade slats above the fever room, their iron hoops hammered flat into latch straps for the lower lids. Nothing remained symbolic for long in Coldwater. Useful things stayed useful. Years later, Brett's gait slowed, but her routines did not. She handed the dawn tally to Lena more often, then to Lena's apprentices, and she spent longer at the teaching blanket where worn tools told their own plain lesson. The survey chain stayed in the chest, oiled and complete. Clara Dunn's satchel was inventoried each quarter and reissued to trained hands. The plain board with gauge notches remained at the 3rd vault, and schoolchildren still traced the deepest mark with their fingers when summer heat climbed. The town expanded by measured additions, not speculation. New deeds required roof runnels before occupancy. Store credit during dry months required proof of household storage maintenance, a rule proposed by Rook himself and audited in public. The failed East Well stayed capped with its carved accounting, and travelers often paused there first, reading costs before they climbed to the basins where the working system ran. In the present season, the largest basin still stands above the North Road, lime-washed and cool under cedar shade. Monitors still call volumes aloud at dawn. The emergency line is still marked in red for widows, children, and travelers. On clear mornings when geese cross earlier than usual, and the cottonwood edges yellow too soon. No one in Coldwater calls those signs superstition now. They call for extra checks, extra lids, extra training shifts. They call it building Graham true.